morning. Man, it's good to see you guys. My name is Nate, and I am planting, my family and I were planting the Front Church, which is a church that's going to be in the Draper Bluffdale area. And I just come first wanting to say thank you. The Bridge is a partner of the Front. And so you guys support us in prayer. You support us with giving. And so thanks for doing that. And I met some of you before. I had a chance to do music here before, but it's really good to be here to teach. That's my family. Leaving the house before 7 a.m. is a little early to bring them all. And so we have 3 girls age 4 and under. And so I thought I'd show you a picture of them just so you get to meet them that way. But you'll get to meet them one day. Now, if you see me and you're a first timer, I just want to say, don't worry, I'm the sub, and Lauren's back next week. So just so you know, I want you guys to know that. One way you can be praying for us before we kind of get going, and that is that we have a mission team coming from Cheyenne, Wyoming, and they're getting into town tonight, and they're serving with us this week, and we're going to hang 5,000 door hangers in Bluffdale, Utah. And this is going to be one of the first chances that people in my own neighborhood are going to hear about the Front Church. So would you pray for 2 things? Would you pray, 1, for a spiritual receptivity for people who receive these door hangers? And 2nd, we're praying that there's a few people in our neighborhood who are like, I've been praying for a church in our neighborhood, and it is an answer to prayer to find out you're here. And so would you pray that with us? That would be awesome. This is a picture of me running the 2014 Twin Cities Marathon in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And has anyone run a marathon before in this room? It was awful. It was awful. It was also amazing, but it was awful. I never wanted to run a marathon. No way. 26.2 miles, are you kidding me? I don't like to run, period. But out of the blue, I got a phone call, or I got an email from a guy I never met. He's like, let me buy you coffee. Okay, I don't usually say no to free coffee. We sit down for coffee. His name is Brad, and Brad says, okay, Nate, here's what we do. I'm with Team World Vision. We convince people who don't run to run marathons to raise money for clean water efforts and places that need clean water. And then he begins to tell me about the person who started this whole thing, his friend. He tells me about his friend who was dealing with a lot of pain, who had a couple unexpected deaths in his family, and how as he began to run and train for a marathon, those began to be really precious times with him and God. Those began to be healing times with him and God. And how as he's running and he's processing his pain and he's getting this time with God and he's getting in shape, he gets this idea like, I could do something with this. And so, man, I leave that meeting with Brad and I think, I want to be closer to God. I want to be in shape. That could be cool to make a difference. And I go home and I say, hey, Robin, what do you think about running a marathon? And I tell her, and 3 years later, I'd trained for 3 marathons. I'd run 2 marathons. Robin ran a marathon, then got pregnant, had a baby, then ran another marathon. Our little small church in Minneapolis, Minnesota raised over $77,000 over the course of those 3 years for clean water efforts around the world. I got in shape. I got friends, one of my best friends. I got community. See, I wanted to be closer to God. I wanted to have community and friends. I wanted to get in shape. I wanted to make a difference. But those things are hard. And what happened is I needed to be invited to dream of another world that was possible. So have you ever been here before? Right? Someone or something comes into your life and they invite you to dream of another world that's possible. And you know that that thing is going to be awful, but amazing. Awful, but amazing. Maybe it was, maybe you took a gamble and you checked out the bridge. Someone invited you to come to the bridge. And you're like, I don't know about church. Like, church is a big gamble for some people. I get it. People have reservations. People have been burned. People have had sour experience. It can be a gamble to come here, but maybe you took a gamble and then it paid off. You got community, you got friends, you got Jesus. Maybe that's your story. Maybe maybe your marriage has been or is right now or was especially hard. You're like, man, this is hard. But you know that you stuck it out in a season when it was hard. And on the other side of that awful is amazing and intimacy and closeness that you didn't have before. Maybe you tried sushi for the first time. And you thought it was going to be awful, and your world was turned upside down. 10 out of 10. I'll take sushi over steak 10 out of 10 times. Judge me if you want. Maybe you invite your neighbors to come to church, and that's a risk, right? That could go bad. Something could happen. They could get the wrong idea. Right? Maybe you risk it. But you risk it, and they come, and they meet Jesus. I don't know. I want us to ask ourselves a question. What gets us over the edge? Where we actually take the risk. Where we go for the thing that could go awful. And maybe it will be awful, but then it'll be amazing. Because, easy is nice. I like easy. I like no risk. I like easy. But what makes the hard worth it? And I think it's that when you're invited to dream of another world that's possible. And so the scripture will be on the screen, but you can also open your Bibles to the book of Matthew, chapter 16. Matthew's about 3/4 of the way back in my Bible. It's right after the book of Malachi, right before the book of Mark. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 16, which means we're going to big number 16, and we're going to go to little number 24. But before we get there, we got to know that we're right in the middle of the Gospel of Matthew. And so what's going on here is Jesus is always inviting people to dream of another world that's possible. He's inviting people to take their next step. He knows who he's working with. And here with his disciples, they were caught right in the middle of Matthew's gospel where they're seeing the potential for another world that's possible. They're seeing Jesus do things they never expected. They're hearing Jesus teach things that they're trying to figure out what to do with them. They're trying to fit it together. They're figuring it out. And so right in the middle of this, we're going to jump into our story. And the thing I need you to hear is that this isn't where Jesus starts, but it's where he tells them he's headed. That's important. And we get to the moment where Jesus drops the "this is going to be awful but amazing" bomb on them. So here we go. Matthew 16, verse 24. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done." What's going on here, Jesus? You got to deny yourself, take up your cross. Like, this is weird stuff Jesus is saying to his disciples. Because right now, they don't know the cross is coming. They don't know the whole story. So when Jesus says, like, you gotta take up your cross, this is strange language. Right? Jesus didn't lead with this either. Like my friend Brad, when he invited me to run the marathon, he didn't lead with, "Man, every Saturday for 6 months, you're going to have to wake up really early on Saturdays." He didn't lead with, "Yeah, man, there's so many episodes of The Office you won't be able to watch because you need to be going on a run instead of watching The Office." Right? He didn't lead with, "Man, I've been injured and powering through injuries is tough." That's not how he led, but he invited me to dream of another world. And Jesus right here has been inviting his disciples to dream of another world that's possible through him and through a life of following him. And now he's here. And he says, "Hey, you got to lose your life for me to find it." This is going to be awful, because losing your life, that's hard. But this is going to be amazing. Jesus' disciples, right, leading up to this moment and even past this moment, they have a certain idea about how this is all supposed to go down. They have a certain idea about how things are supposed to turn out. So at the beginning of Matthew 16, tensions are flaring up between Jesus and the religious leaders. So Matthew tells us that. And then Matthew 16, 5 through 12, Jesus is cautioning his disciples, saying, hey, be careful about the teaching of the religious people. Be careful about that. And then in Matthew 16, verse 13, we have this big moment. It's a big moment. It's a monumental moment. And so I want to look at that real quick. Matthew 16, big number 16, little number 13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Well, what about you? He asked, who do you say I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. But Jesus says, who do people say I am? And Peter says, you're the Messiah. And he's right. Jesus is the Messiah. But we got to hit the pause button. Because what did it look like? What were the disciples expecting when they used the term Messiah? Their Messiah, the Messiah in the minds of the disciples, the messianic expectations around the first century, what they were expecting a Messiah to do was to throw down. Right? A Messiah was going to come in and throw down. A Messiah was going to bear the sword. A Messiah was going to get off with the Roman heads. A Messiah was going to liberate the people of God from the bondage of Rome. That was what a Messiah was supposed to do. And they're expecting some sort of a throwdown up to this point. They keep expecting it after. Peter draws a sword at one time to protect Jesus' life because he's expecting a throwdown. And so one thing I want us to realize right away is when people start to follow Jesus, not just start, when people follow Jesus, when you and me follow Jesus, start now into the future, we're still figuring it out. They're still figuring it out. They don't quite get all this stuff that he's talking about, how he intends his messiahship to look. They don't quite get it. And Jesus, he knows who he's working with. He's not upset. He knows who he's working with. And so he's teaching them new things. He's showing them new things. But I want us to catch this too, and this is especially important for our world right now. There's something about Jesus that can bring people together from entirely different political persuasions, from entirely different backgrounds, from entirely different walks of life. See, people on Jesus' team, there were a few of them that had very different how to change the world philosophies. Okay? Simon the Zealot, his how to change the world philosophy is let's pull out our swords. Today it'd be let's pull out our guns. Let's take care of business. Let's take care of the Romans. Let's cut some heads off. That's Simon the Zealot. That's what zealots thought they should do. That's what Simon thought he should do. That's Simon. And then you have Matthew. Matthew's a tax collector. Unlike Simon, Matthew decides, you know what? How I'm going to change the world is just take care of me. So I'm going to buddy up with those in political power, and I'm going to do their bidding for them. I'm going to betray my own Jewish people for Rome, and I'm going to help them tax people, and I'm going to get rich. I'm going to live a nice, easy life. So if you're tracking, one person on Jesus' team says, off with Roman heads. The other person on Jesus' team says, let's get close to Rome so that we make it all nice for ourselves. Okay? And then you have Galilean fishermen, which I just imagine like them like straight out of an episode of Duck Dynasty or something. Right? Like these people had no business being together. But under Jesus, they're being invited to see the world in a new way. To see how to change the world in a new way. And Jesus can still do that today. Let's keep going. Let's unpause. We're going to go to verse 21. So after Peter says, Jesus, you're the Messiah, it says, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Life following Jesus is like 2 steps forward and sometimes 2 steps backwards. I think sometimes we like to think of our faith life or life with Jesus as like this linear line slowly moving up instead of like this weird, funky spiral thing that goes all over the place but kind of sort of moves up a little bit eventually. Like Peter is still learning. Now we have to ask ourselves a question, why is he so taken aback? Like Peter is so like perplexed and agitated by Jesus' words that he pulls Jesus, the guy who just said he's the Messiah, he pulls Jesus aside and tells him he's wrong. Right, like, what is happening here? Here's what's happening. For anyone in Jesus' day, for any first century Jewish person, dead messiahs meant failed messiahs. So for Jesus to say, I'm going to die, Peter says, no way, because if you die, you can't be Messiah. Right? This is not just something that we see in the Bible. We actually see this play out historically. In 66 AD, we meet a potential Messiah, the Jewish Messiah by the name of Simon Bar Giora. People think he's the guy. People think he's going to deliver them from Rome. He dies. Movement disappears. Guess he's not the guy. He died. 133 AD, there's a guy named Simon, son of the star. Simon, son of the star, is such a big deal that the most famous rabbi in 133 AD, Rabbi Akiba, says he's the Messiah. He's the fulfiller of this ancient prophecy. He's the guy. They get around. The Jewish people are so convinced that Simon the Star is the Messiah, they start dating their coins, year 1, year 2, year 3, because they think this is it. This is God's new age. Well, what happens? He dies. Then what happens? His movement dies. Jesus says, I'm going to die. Peter says, no, that's not how it works, because that's not how it works. So here's the big historical quandary, and this is our side note. We're going to come back. We have to ask ourselves a really important question. Why didn't Jesus' movement die? Jesus died. Movement doesn't die. Movement explodes. That's not how it worked. Why didn't Jesus' movement die? Now, one of my favorite theologians, his name is N.T. Wright. And N.T. Wright talks about it this way. He says, imagine yourself sitting outside at a cafe, enjoying a cup of coffee, and all of a sudden you hear boom! And then after the boom, you see a police car and you hear sirens. And then you see an ambulance and you hear sirens. And then you see a fire truck and you hear sirens. He says, now, is it possible that the boom, the police car, the ambulance, the fire truck are all going to separate things, dealing with separate instances? Of course it is. But what is the most likely explanation for boom, fire truck, ambulance, police car? The most likely explanation is they're all a part of the same thing. What a lot of people do when they look at the Jesus movement is they try to create explanations as to why the movement grew like it did. But what they're trying to do in all actuality is they're trying to say that the four things are unconnected and moving in different directions. But when you look at it all, and when you put it all together, what actually makes the most sense of the explosive growth of the Jesus movement is that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. That's why the movement didn't die. Back to Peter. Peter's just saying what everyone else is thinking. He says, no way, Jesus, you're not going to die. How is a dead Messiah? How does that work? They're trying to figure it out. Historically, the Christian church has taught that Jesus is 100% God, all divinity from the beginning of time, living in a person. 100% God, but Jesus is also 100% man, full humanity. Not 50%, not 25%, but full humanity, 100%, 100%. Sometimes I think when we think about Jesus, we think that he floated 6 feet off the ground and did some magic tricks to impress some people. But that's not what the Christian church teaches, that yes, fully divine, but fully man, fully human. And I think sometimes when we think about the awful but amazing thing that God may be calling us to, I think that what happens is we can determine that is worth it. It is worth it to do it. And then what happens? a voice, maybe in our head, or maybe a friend, or maybe someone else says, don't do it. Don't do it. It's not worth it. What happens for Jesus here is Peter is that voice. Jesus sets his eyes forward. He says, this is what's going to happen. This is what needs to be done. And Peter says, don't do it. So look at what Jesus says. Verse 23, Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but human concern. Jesus won't listen to the voice that says, don't do it. He has singular focus. He's determined that the awful but amazing thing is worth it. I'm reminded of Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, which says that Jesus, for the joy set before him, endured the cross. And so this sets us up for Jesus' words that we look at. We're going to look at them again. So after this whole exchange, Jesus says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be if someone gains the whole world, yet forfeits their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and he'll reward each person according to what they have done. Jesus didn't start here, but he lets them know this is where he's headed. And everything in this story is about incremental steps, next steps. They don't quite get it, but they're piecing it together. They really don't get it. And then they sort of get it, but like even when Jesus says this, they don't quite get it. They won't quite get it for some time. But Jesus is serious about this. And he's serious about this because he knows the other world that's possible when people follow him. Another world is possible when people follow Jesus. I love Peter. He gives me hope I don't got to have it all together. I don't have to have it all figured out, right? Peter, look at him. He's this Galilean fisherman. Often his mouth gets before his actions, right? He thinks he could tell Jesus that Jesus is wrong, right? He tries to chop off a guy's head when Jesus is being arrested in the garden. He misses his head. The guy ducks, gets his ear. Boom. Like, he denies Jesus when Jesus is arrested, says, I don't know him. This same Peter who said, I don't know him, stands in front of some people who quite likely were responsible to put Jesus on the cross in Acts chapter 2, and he goes from fearful and afraid to bold, telling people about Jesus. He goes from the guy who's ready to pull his sword out to defend his own life to the guy who lays down his life, and Christian tradition tells us he was crucified upside down. Jesus knows what's on the other side, the world that's on the other side of following him. Look at Matthew. Love Matthew. Tax collector. Buddy with Rome. Living good by taking advantage of his own people. Living good because he's in a position of political power. Look who he becomes. He becomes the guy who writes the Gospel of Matthew. He's so captivated with the message that he can't help but say, people got to know this. People got to know this. Matthew is the type of guy who, he includes these words, like we're in his gospel this morning, Matthew chapter 16. He includes these words of Jesus that says, if you want to come after me, deny yourself, take up your cross, follow me. If you try and save your life, you'll lose it. But if you lose your life for Jesus, you'll save it. He includes those words, and he knows that reality. He was trying to save his life. He was trying to live, just live a nice, easy life. That's what he was doing, and he can speak to the fact that when I was doing that, I was losing my life. But when I lost my life for Jesus, I found it. He can speak to that. Who was Simon the Zealot? Simon the Zealot wanted to chop off some heads. Who did Simon the Zealot become? He followed a Jesus who laid down his life for his enemies. Not guns blazing, but praying for the forgiveness of his enemies on the cross. Jesus knows the world on the other side of following him. See, the world in Jesus' time, and still today, divided. Divided along ethnic lines, divided along political lines, divided along nationality lines. And what does the church become? The church becomes the first multi-ethnic community the world has ever seen. The church. Jesus knows what's on the other side of denying ourselves, taking our cross, and following him. He knows the world is possible. The world's values at the time of Jesus, this gets a little crazy. There's this historian, his name is Tom Holland. I like him. He's not a Christian, but he talks about how he began to experience some inner tension because he began to ask himself the question, where do my values come from? Because they sure don't look Roman. They sure don't look Greek. Look at this. He says, the more years I spent immersed in the study of classical antiquity, that's the time around Jesus, so the more alien I increasingly found it. The values of Leonidas, whose people had practiced a peculiarly murderous form of eugenics and trained their young to kill uppity, I don't know what that word is, by night, were nothing that I recognized of as my own, nor were those of Caesar, who was reported to have killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved 1 million more. It was not just the extremes of callousness that unsettled me, but the complete lack of any sense that the poor or the weak might have the slightest intrinsic value. Why did I find this disturbing? Because in my morals and ethics, I was not a Spartan or a Roman at all. He's saying, where did my values that the poor matter and the weak matter, where did those come from? They didn't come from Rome. They didn't come from Greece. Look at this next slide. He says, even though he doesn't really believe in God, he's startled to discover that assumptions that I'd grown up with about how a society should properly be organized and the principles that it should uphold were not bred of classical antiquity, still less of human nature, but very distinctively of the civilization's Christian past. So profound has been the impact of Christianity on the development of Western civilization that it has come to be hidden from view. It is the incomplete revolutions which are remembered. The fate of those which triumph is to be taken for granted. What is he saying? Simply put, when we zoom out and we look, we have to know that the world looked a certain way in Jesus' time. The world had certain values in Jesus' time. We have different values now. We have different values than the world at that time. What happened? What happened, simply put, is people were captivated by the vision Jesus offered. They took up their cross, they denied themselves, they laid down their lives, and they found it, and our values in our world began to shift. Look at what Tertullian, he's an ancient church historian and theologian, he lived from 155 to 230 AD. He's feisty. And he's writing to some people who are have political power and who hold to different religious faith. And here's what he says. He says, you forget that notwithstanding your persecution, far from conspiring against you, as our numbers would perhaps furnish us with the means of doing, we pray for you and do good to you, that if we give nothing for your gods, we do give for your poor, and that our charity spreads more alms in your streets than the offerings presented by your religion in your temples. The world is changing. The world is changing because Jesus' people are taking his call seriously. Look at the Roman Emperor Julian. It's 100 years later, definitely not a Christian, 361 to 363 AD. He launches a campaign because he's jealous of the movement that happened among Christian charities. And so he's trying to start his own religious charities. And he writes to his own pagan priest, and he says, I think that when the poor happen to be neglected and overlooked by the priest, the impious Galileans, that's the Christians, observed this and devoted themselves to benevolence. The impious Galileans support not only their poor, but ours as well. Everyone can see that our people lack aid from us. What is going on? This is what's going on. The world is turning upside down because people, Jesus' people, are they're denying themselves, they're taking up their cross, and they're following him. They're not trying to save their lives, they're losing their lives. And when they lose their lives for him, they're finding it. And the world is changing. Jesus knows what's on the other side of the awful but amazing ask that he is making here. He knows, and his followers will learn as we learn, next step by next step, that awful but amazing thing is worth it, and that another world is possible when we follow Jesus. Maybe this morning, the only thing you need to hear is that awful but amazing thing, that risk that you've been thinking about, that thing that you've been considering doing, but you're not sure, and you think God is pulling you in that direction, but you're not sure. Maybe this morning you just need to hear it's worth it. It's worth it. Maybe for you, that risk is just making a commitment to the bridge. Maybe you've come some. Maybe you've checked it out. But your reservations, you've been burned by the church before. You've had sour experience with the church before. And you have reservations, but God is saying, let's go. Let's go. Maybe that's the risk you need to take. Maybe you want to come help us plant a church in Draper, Utah. Talk to me after if that's you. Maybe that thing, that risk, that thing that you just need to go after and you know it's going to be hard is you got to do some work with the person you're married to. I think we all want to be the elderly couple that we see walking hand in hand. What a lot of us maybe don't realize or fail to consider is that elderly couple, their love for one another was not just a ooey-gooey feeling. It was a fierce commitment to one another through hell. They've been through it. They come out the other side and they hold hands. I think sometimes we approach marriage and we think marriage is for love. And we forget that actually marriage is how teaches us how to love. With our marriage, maybe your next step this morning is to recognize that actually, if you put an expectation that your spouse is supposed to fulfill you, that will crush them. And if they put an expectation that you are supposed to fulfill them, that will crush you. Marriage is not meant to be us fulfilling each other. It is meant to teach us how to love. But who do we look to for fulfillment? We look to Jesus for fulfillment. Jesus is our fulfillment. Jesus is our reason to live. Jesus helps us love one another. And if you aren't looking to Jesus, you will crush one another with those expectations. But if you look to Jesus, you can see life breathed back into your marriage that feels kind of dead right now. Our marriages need Jesus. Maybe that's awful. But amazing thing is you got to go for it. And it might be awful for a while. Maybe the awful but amazing thing you got to do is give up easy. Easy's so nice, isn't it? Our routines, so nice. Look at this quote. Let it kick your butt. Like it kicked my butt 2 weeks ago. This guy, Peyton Jones, says, bored with a life of mundanity, we vainly attempt to satiate the restlessness by substituting our adventurous calling with entertainment. Gorging nightly on a multimedia frenzy, we become voyeurs living vicariously through viewing the titillating lives of fictional characters like Jack Bauer and the exploits of real-life sports superstars. Like the taste buds that crave sugar while the body craves nutrients, the deeper cry of our soul is silenced by the deafening sound of society's soul-numbing idolatry of entertainment. We're constantly bombarded by virtual images of others who are living the adventure instead of living it ourselves. As a result, we find ourselves unable to sit in stillness and reflect on our festering disease of dis-ease. Do our routines tell the story of deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me? Or do they tell the story of not deny yourself? Easy. We're settling for sugar instead of food. Maybe this morning it's time to take the next step in your spiritual life. Now, spiritual life is not like different from every other part of life. Like, we don't think that these are two different things, spiritual life and actual life. Well, what the bridge teaches, I guarantee, I didn't make sure with Lauren, but I can guarantee this one. What the Bridge teaches, what the Front Church teaches, is that spiritual life informs the rest of life. It informs, it's not spiritual and everything else. It's spiritual informs it all. And maybe the next step in your spiritual life is it's time for you to talk out your doubts. You've been stuffing them. You're scared to be honest about them. You're scared to be honest about maybe unbelief, disbelief, questions you have. Maybe you've been told you can't be honest about them. But maybe your next step is to share it with someone at the Bridge. To talk it out. Maybe that's your next step. Jesus is not afraid of our doubts. Maybe your next step is to say yes to Jesus. See, here's the thing about Jesus. He's not asking us to clean up our lives before we come to him. Look at the disciples. Look at them. That's not what he asked. He just said, come. You don't got to do all this cleaning. You come. We don't have to do all this cleaning. We come. And Jesus walks with us. Here's the other thing I was thinking about as I was wrestling through this scripture. It just gripped me, especially this morning, last night. I'm thinking, a hard life with God's presence is better than a good life with God's absence. Matthew tells us, he includes this in his gospel, and at the very end of his gospel, you know what he guarantees? Jesus doesn't say at the end of Matthew's gospel, and Matthew records it because he thought it's important for us to know. Jesus doesn't say you're going to have the best life ever. What Jesus says is, I will be with you always to the end of the age. My presence will be with you. My presence will be with you. A hard life with God's presence is better than the best life with God's absence. So church, Jesus is calling us to something. He calls us to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. Lose our lives, so that in him we find them. And this is for Jesus' sake, and this is for the sake of our world. In church, we're called to be like my friend Brad to our world. When my friend Brad holds out that marathon, tantalizing me with it, what we're called to do with what it means to be Jesus' people is to help people dream of the world that's possible when we follow Jesus. And to help them see he's been birthing it. He's been at work doing it in people's lives and in our world. It's been happening. Following Jesus is worth it. The only thing that can heal our divisions, we're dividing. I feel like the wedge between people just gets wider and wider and wider and wider. And we're like, what will do it? What will fix it? It's Jesus. Jesus is the only one who says, I'll tell you what to do. If you want to change people, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Turn the other cheek. That's going to do it. And why? How can we do that? Because that's what he did for us. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Not while we cleaned ourselves up. Not while we made ourselves worthy and righteous in God's eyes. But while we were still sinners, he died for us. And because of that, we can return hate with love. We can return rejection with kindness. Our world needs this. The church needs this. We're so easily duped. Following Jesus is worth it. We're to be the fragrance of Christ to the world around us. We help people take their next step towards Jesus. Jesus loves you. He knows who he's working with. And he loves you anyway. All the way to the cross.